Greetings, my friends. This is Celeria Rosencrux, and in this video we shall be looking at the introductory sequence to FromSoftware's beloved video game Dark Souls.
In the Age of Ancients.
So, first off we establish a context. We are peering into this world starting from the point which is referred to as the Age of Ancients. We don't know what that implies yet. It might mean that this is the age from which the oldest entities that still exist hail from. It could mean that this is the oldest period where life itself existed. It certainly means that there are other ages involved in this world's timeline, but beyond that, we cannot yet know.
The world was unformed, shrouded by fog.
After this, we come to know that this world, as it said, was unformed and shrouded by fog. Three things are worth noting here. 1. The world being unformed means that this is clearly a creation account, where, like in Genesis 1, everything was formless. This immediately suggests that we are looking at a Western, culturally sourced setting, to at least some extent. Secondly, rather than darkness being on the face of the deep, this world is shrouded by fog, which invokes Greek mythology, where, at least in some tellings of things, the beginning of the world featured a caligo which represented the potential for things to be, which was not yet actualized. Caligo translates to fog, but it is a reiteration of the formlessness of everything, because matter had not been caused to have shape and distinction as of then. Thirdly, we see that there are trees present in the fog, which appear to be petrified. This suggests that the formlessness of everything was not actually complete, but rather there were already existing objects within the otherwise indistinct landscape. This is largely because the fog at the beginning of the world is a pre-established concept in FromSoftware's games via Demon Souls. It is a sort of cosmic force which can invade a world which already exists and start to break everything down on a fundamental level, producing madness along with the material effects, and stripping entities of their souls. Thus, at least in this game world, the beginning is established to be the aftermath of the apocalypse.
A land of grey crags, arch trees, and everlasting dragons.
The narration then goes on to spell out that the survivors of this previous world are entities which are made of stone, dragons, petrified trees, and the rock of the world itself, all of which is drained of color. But, as we learn in the very first game from FromSoft, Kingsfield, that which is stone can still have life. In fact, humanity is characterized as being of an earthen nature, such that necromancy is made roughly equivalent to the creation of golems. Thus, these dragons and trees are not husks, but successful remnants of the world before, which were able to retain their spark despite the fog's destabilizing effects.
But then there was fire.
Therefore, a breaking of equilibrium. While everything was without distinction at the beginning, here, a breakpoint somehow tips the balance of things, causing the foggy nature of the world to be dispersed. This is akin to the greater will sundering the one great in Elden Ring, but we get no explanation for how fire emerges in Dark Souls. Certainly not here at the very least. You will notice that we start to approach the base of a tree on this note.
And with fire came disparity.
Which is a natural result of the fog being disrupted, but is also reflective of thermodynamics. If you have a state of perfect equilibrium and then add a source of heat at any given position, it will cause outward-bearing ripples that form distinctions within the space, like the reverberating ripples which emerge in the face of a previously still body of water when a stone is thrown into it. Additionally, as we hear this statement, we head into the tree's roots, and see that because it is a petrified tree, passing amidst the root network and the cavities carved out by their presence, brings us into a space which begins to look like a cave.
Heat and cold, life and death, and of course, light and dark.
Are all two sides of the same coin, not only individually but as a whole. They are representative of ideas surrounding time and space. Thus it is that this is truly the beginning, despite the Twilight Realm, which had already persisted. Now, though, as we see the cave lit up by roaring flame at the back, we begin to perceive a complicated tableau, where shadow and light interweave with each other, reflective of the contours of the world in which the fire dwells. This is important to note for later.
Then, from the dark, they came.
As established, dark is aligned with death and with space. Thus, we must take this as being natural necromancy, which led the dead to rise from the earth, the space already present. You can see this borne out in the way that these lift themselves up. They are stiffly pulling themselves out of the earth into which the arch tree is sunk, in front of the fire which has softened the stone which was previously frozen for lack of time.
And found the souls of lords within the flame.
This is a complicated and difficult thing to decipher at this time. We don't have context for it immediately. With the next scene, we can begin to have an idea, though.
Nito, the first of the dead.
When it says this and shows a skeletal hand clasping at a mote of fire, we can see that this is not just listing the names of the lords who were previous owners of the souls, for time just began. There was not a previous to begin with. Rather, because it is naming the skeletal man and calling out first of the dead, we can take the narrator to be telling us that the souls of lords were in fact their souls. They, whoever they were before then, found their own souls amongst the fire. Thus fire, light, and time are linked with soul. It is from fire that the soul is derived, or within it that it is housed. This speaks to an idea that fire is what defines humanity, which is also a very Greek concept, for in Greek myth, it is a gift which Prometheus steals from the gods of Olympus in order to distinguish humans from the rest of the animals. At the same time, this is answering a very interesting question which is implicit in that. How did the gods have fire in the first place? Dark Souls suggests, well, they must have found it. The fact that Nito is mentioned first and that he is first of the dead calls to mind Hades, who was the oldest brother amongst the Olympian gods. He is the first of the dead in the same way that the Roman emperors were first citizens, that is, chief amongst them. Equivalent to a lord, you might say. Thus we see that lord is an expression to mean god in this setting. First of the dead is a divine title, and what follows of denotes domain. As the camera pans back from Nito's clasping hand, which calls to mind Incha's clinging bone from Elden Ring, we can notice an oddity with it. That is, the thumb is on the opposite side as you would expect for a human. This might seem odd, and initially it called to mind the Rakshasa, but upon very careful inspection, it would appear that it is actually two thumbs he is possessed of, one on either side of the hand, and thus this is what is called the Hamza hand, or the hand of Miriam, which is a Middle Eastern sign for warding off the evil eye and thus disease and curse affliction, which is rather ironic, all things considered. Looking upon the rest of him as it pans further out, the fact that Nito is revealed to have a collar or necklace bearing a significant amount of human bones, and especially skulls, calls to mind the Indian goddess Shahina Masta, who symbolizes the gift of life and its severance, as well as temporality and immortality. All of these seem to be appropriate themes for one who is at once the first of those to acquire a soul, and an undying skeletal mass which is even less fleshed than the stumbling creatures which we saw emerge from the earth. It is also worth noting that this deity holds in her left hand her head, which we might say is equivalent to the flame that Nito holds, which is his lord's soul, if the comparison is true and properly followed through, and holds in her right hand a sword. We shall keep this in mind for the future and see if he is shown with a sword in his other hand later on.
The Witch of Izalith.
Next amongst those to acquire our Lord's soul is the Witch of Izalith. The first thing to note is that she appears to be the first individual who acquires a soul to be properly fleshed out, so to speak. Not only does her body appear to be properly clad with muscle, skin, and fat, she is possessed of significant beauty, although she chooses to shroud herself in full body covering and a shadowy hood, which suggests modesty has come to her along with life. Other than Nito covering himself in the bones of other people, this is the first clothing which we see. While he may potentially be wearing those as trophies, or they could simply be an extension of his nature as the Lord of Dead, she seems to be possessed of a similar impulse to Adam and Eve in Genesis. Upon acquiring the knowledge of good and evil, they realized that they were naked, and so sought to hide their nudity as such. It is also the case that her hands are burnt by this flame, suggesting that either the nature of her version is different, or that there is something which is inherently dangerous about fire, and she had to learn this the hard way when she lost her innocence. That she is called a witch in the first place should be somewhat jarring, as she's clearly akin to Nito and should be called a god. Whether this is a term of derogation, something she chose to identify herself with spontaneously, or an insult which she chose to try and reclaim in rejection of that potential stigmatization, we cannot know as of now. Given, however, Demon Souls was immediately before Dark Souls, and one of our character's main companions in that story was a woman who was persecuted unjustly and labeled a witch, perhaps we ought to cautiously proceed with an understanding that she might actually be a victim, perhaps one who was betrayed by those closest to her, which one might imagine to be the other gods at this point.
And her daughters of chaos.
After a moment, it pans out and shows that the Witch of Izalith is a mother. As such, we can perhaps suggest that she might be akin to Metis, Zeus's first wife, who helped him in his war against the previously ruling powers in the world and then was betrayed and devoured by him thereafter. That her children are called the Daughters of Chaos is most interesting, insofar as you can take this two ways. One, they could be being called enemies of order, which would fit with the idea that their mother might have been betrayed and subsequently demonized. Or one could consider that chaos is similar to Caligo, insofar that it is the disordered state at the beginning of the world. Thus, the statement could be, in the time of chaos before order was brought to the world, she bore these daughters.
Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight.
Is the third name we have heard, and it is the second name where the person is not alone. Where the Witch of Izalith had her daughters, Gwyn has his.
And his faithful knights.
But Nito has no one. He is alone and bears the bones of others who might have been his companions at one point upon his body, if he ever had any. Somewhat fitting insofar as death is something which is at least first blush a seemingly solitary event, despite the ripple effects that one's demise can have on all the others around you. Regardless, back to Gwyn. He wears a crown and is thus a king. By being presented as such, by having wizened appearance, including a massive grey beard, by having the biggest flame we have yet seen, and by being the sun god in a world where fire is associated with divinity, one can take it as being highly probable that this person is the chief amongst the deities. 3 is a number often associated with divinity as well, meaning his position in this list reinforces this prospect. As such, if the Witch of Izalith was betrayed, then it is likely that Gwyn is the one who betrayed her. At the very least, he would be in a position of power to do so. And if she is based on Metis, then it naturally follows that he might be based on Zeus. That Gwyn's knights are placed in a position equivalent to the Daughters of Chaos implies that he thinks of his knights as his children as well, which presents an interesting dynamic wherein the character might be a flawed and complicated one. Having them be knights as well suggests that a significant amount of time might be passing during this age of ancients as the gods are rising up. Just as was the case for Zeus's efforts to overthrow the Titans, significant time and effort must have gone into planning whatever war he was intending to wage. For that is what must be happening. Knights conceptually depend upon war to exist. Also note, these are faithful knights, which contrasts Gwyn's likely betrayal of the witch.
And the furtive pygmy.
Lastly, we have the furtive pygmy. Furtive means they are secretive and trying to avoid detection, perhaps to avoid trouble. Pygmy implies they are a small figure amongst significantly larger ones. This title suggests that there are giants in this setting, and I would add that there are further meanings which come to mind. One, it references the fact that the fire they find is significantly smaller than that which the other gods possess, perhaps leading to fear of them. Secondly, it means this individual is somewhat averse to the light. To hide, one must use stealth and embrace shadow, and thus it might suggest that this individual is perhaps averse to Gwyn, who has the most light and is associated with the sun. Thirdly, often the trouble that one who is described as furtive is looking to avoid is that of a crime which they have committed, meaning they might at least think of what they have done as stealing fire. As such, this figure seems like they might be the actual representative of Prometheus, who was invoked earlier when the question of how the gods got fire in the first place was asked. Thus, it is both natural that such a thief of fire be invoked in this intro sequence, and ought to be expected that this person went on to distribute fire, that this figure shared its meager flame with humanity, so that all humans might have souls rather than the gods alone. Just like Prometheus, it would appear that this person's crime has likely failed to avoid detection as well. After all, though two of the other gods were given names in this sequence, the furtive pygmy's name has been blotted from history, and the ones whom they shared their fire with are not mentioned here, even in the generic sense. Even so, as we watch this individual cradle fire, we shall see the shadow take shape.
So easily forgotten.
Rapidly appearing to gestate, as if a fetus in the womb, as this individual gingerly gets off the ground and properly stands on 2 feet. Thus, the furtive pygmy's sequence is invoking not only the idea of a child being born, but also a toddler aging and coming into their own, humanity gaining its identity as it first acquires the ability to cook, stay warm, and properly shape the environment, for fire has become a tool which was available to it. This is an essential part of what propelled humanity's success in real life as well, and so it is most appropriate that the Dark Souls would invoke it here.
With the strength of lords, they challenge the dragons.
Which does not disinclude either the furtive pygmy or the Witch of Izalith, suggesting that whatever falling out occurred would be subsequent to the initial period of cooperation. All of them challenged the dragons together. As we can see, the dragon they first show has 2 rows of teeth as well, evoking the dragon god from Demon Souls. This is obviously somewhat intriguing as far as connections go, and would imply that either Demon Souls is somehow a prequel to Dark Souls, or there is some sort of multiversal connection which causes all true dragons to bear this sort of physiology. Given the fact we already are dealing with a world that is emerging from a fog akin to that which is in Demon Souls, the former of these 2 options would seem the more likely.
Gwyn's mighty bolts peeled apart their stone scales.
Here we see it confirmed that Gwyn is acting as stand-in for Zeus by way of him wielding the lightning bolt as his weapon in the war against the dragons. These divine attacks, which are most curious insofar as he is a sun god, not a storm god, as far as the earlier narratives suggested, unless of course these two are being conflated here, and suggested to be manifestations of the same underlying principle. These, needless to say, are capable of bringing death to that which was previously immortal. Given what we were just made aware of before this, we see that this is fire's affinity with time causing what is otherwise in stasis, locked in stone and timeless as such, to be given temporal features. To be possessed of time in this sense is to be capable of change, and thus capable of dying. This is very similar to how the Nords defeated the dragons and overthrew them in the Elder Scrolls. But it is somewhat inverted. Dragons in the Elder Scrolls series are creatures purely of time. They are children of the god thereof, and so have an unlimited amount of it. However, when the concept of mortality is introduced into their being via words of power, they plummet and are made vulnerable. Thus, we see virtually the same concept playing out here. The lightning bolts of Gwyn and his army sunder the stone scales of the dragons, and so strip them of their immortality.
The witches weaved great firestorms.
The Witch of Izalith then introduces dragons to fire's capacity to burn, which she knew all too well. In conflagration, fire devours and turns all to fuel.
Nito unleashed a miasma of death and disease.
Nito raising his right arm, which, rather than carrying a sword, is one, would use his power to reap the enemies which were already weakened by all which had come before, introducing them to the weakness of the flesh with which time naturally sees all mortals afflicted. Thus did they succumb. The furtive pygmy and humanity were surely there too, but just as the individual's name was, their part in this battle was blotted from history, and so we cannot hear whatever deeds which they surely must have accomplished.
And Seath the Scaleless betrayed his own, and the dragons were no more.
And it would seem there was one other. Rather than give the furtive pygmy their due, history instead records the contributions of a traitor to their kind. The last dragon, who had no scales of which to speak. He was different. Implicitly he must have emerged during this time of disparity, for the stone which defined the dragons was that which allowed them to survive the fog. Thus he was likely treated differently by his own kind, perceived as a mutant, a freak. And so he would become an avenger of himself, who would show his fury to all who had wronged him. But that pale, fairy-winged creature looks a sorry sight. His voice thrums with mourning, as if a deep regret struck him as he stood atop the pile of corpses his vengeance had wrought. All his family, all who he had ever known in those earliest days of his life, they were gone, and he was all that remained. It was as if the entire species had perished, as the narrator suggests. But he did have those who aided him in the war. Perhaps Gwyn would be kinder to Seath than the witch or the pygmy. After all, his name would be remembered.
Thus began the Age of Fire.
So the narration claims. This is important as fire was already present in the Age of Ancients, and was an extremely important part of the emerging nature of the world. However, it was not until the forces which were defined by fire overthrew the old order that the new age would begin. This is the same as is the case, for example, in Elden Ring, where the stars are a very significant part of the world-building in general long before it is possible for the Tarnished to potentially usher in an age of stars at the end of the game. should they choose to do so.
But soon the flames will fade, and only dark will remain.
Up until this point, the game has been telling us history, or prehistory at first. In retrospect, it has been speaking of things that have happened and giving us all the necessary context to understand some of the implications for that which would occur beyond the scope of that portion of the tale. Now, however, things have changed. Soon, as the voice proclaims, the flames will fade and only dark will remain. As such, we must understand that the events of almost an entire age will have just been passed over, and our story shall begin in the moment of gloam and ash. As fire is symbolic of civilization, and has been shown to be connected with the very soul, we are therefore put into a very dire situation indeed.
Even now, there are only embers, and man sees not light, but only endless nights. And amongst the living are seen carriers of the accursed dark sign.
Even now there are only embers, the voice says, as hands reach up to clasp around one of them, as if desperately fighting off the cold and dark, calling back to how gingerly the furtive pygmy clutched the fire which it held. As we can see, though, this woman who reaches up to the ember does so with the same sort of impulse as well, for she does not take it for herself, but guides the ember downwards, offering it up to the corpse before her, as if trying to grant the dead man life once more. And she does so after a fashion, for among the living are seen carriers of the accursed dark sign, which must be the flaming hole the ember burns within the corpse. As such, she must have committed what has become a grave taboo. Replacing the meager flame of the pygmy with an even smaller spark must put the body, already bearing the legacy of its ancestors once broken away from the inanimate, soulless immortality which came to men in the age of the ancients, in quite the difficult position. Rather than people seeing them as possessed of life or death, perhaps they see them as accursed with something in between. It is also worth noting that, with the statement that man sees not light but endless nights, there is a strong implication that during the Age of Fire, Gwyn, the god of sunlight, must have perished. Perhaps this is why the idea associated with him has begun to diminish. Maybe once a god has taken up the mantle of some sort of concept in that way, they become inextricably bound up in it, and so like Baldur's death signaled the coming of Ragnarok, Gwyn's would represent the beginning of his age's dusk. It is on that note which we begin our story. But before we move on, let us consider the three names which we have been given so far. Nito is written in Japanese using ni as in tree and to as in lake, a pool of water. Taking the pronunciation of the word and phonetically transcribing it into Japanese, however, could also lead one to write a different form of to, where it would be read as end, and that version of to is also derived from a character that reads shi, as in death. Likewise, one could choose to write a different version of ni, such as that in ningen, which is to say humanity. Thus his name could be taken as a pun, both suggesting that humanity pooled underneath the arch trees like water, bubbling up when the fire first appeared, and also suggesting that Nito as the first of the dead represents the natural end to which all humanity flows. That is, death. I would also hazard a guess that there is a good chance his name is intended to evoke finito, which means it is finished in Italian. This would obviously be another sort of way which we can derive a meaning related to death for his name, and so the pun seems to have quite the potent reading to it. Moving on, we see that Gwyn is named after the word for white in Welsh. This can be taken as a reference to sunlight being full-spectrum light, that is, light which has not been separated into multiple colors. Thus the choice to give that name to the Lord of Sunlight. This may have other meanings laying under the surface, however. For example, if he is dead by the start of the game, this might be a second-degree pun, meaning that by naming him White, it is also evoking the undead creature with that name, or the other definition of the same Germanic-rooted word. Some unspecified person, often one who is regarded as especially unfortunate. This would be comparing the character we play as to Gwen, as we are undead, which we shall soon see, and would obviously have major implications for the story itself. Perhaps we are going to follow in his footsteps and start up a new age. Then finally we have Seath, which I take to have two primary meanings. He is like Seth, the child of Adam and Eve, who should have been blessed with immortality, and yet was not through no fault of his own. He inherited a broken world which his parents brought him into, and had to deal with the consequences of never tasting the paradise that his parents knew. Additionally, I believe his name is intended to be a riff on seethe, as in to experience deep, partially suppressed rage. This may reflect how he felt with regards to his fellow dragons before he rebelled, and could explain why he did so. Or it could be taken as potentially reflecting the emotional turbulence we saw he experienced after all the other dragons had perished.
Yes, indeed. The dark sign brands the undead.
We then transition to a dark, dank passageway, where there are undead wasting away and rats flitting about. We hear the words, "The dark sign brands the undead," which is a choice made specifically to obscure the fact that it is not getting on the undead at random. People are applying it, as we just saw. But it does represent a visually apparent stigma distinguishing them from the rest of humanity.
And in this land, the undead are corralled and led to the north.
Furthermore, humanity treats the undead like livestock, as is implied by the previous use of the word brand, forcing them into places like this. That what land this one isn't specified hardly matters. It could be any land possessed by humanity implicitly. After we're pushed to the fringes of the world, we are shut in as if in a pen, but not to be slaughtered, and to thereby be at least of some use to people like cattle might.
Where they are locked away to await the end of the world.
No. The wasting is the intent. Humans want us to rot, and to never show our faces to them again. Out of sight, out of mind, we might not do to them any harm. Seems such is the hope, at the very least.
This is your fate.
But by saying this, the game challenges us to prove them wrong. And then we shall be given an opportunity to moments later. For when this hostile, deceptive narrator stops blabbing, a knight in shining armor appears. Not one of Gwyn's faithful knights, nothing so divine as that. But we're given a chance here. and we're going to take it. This is how we defy fate at the Northern Undead Asylum.